is when you look at scientifically validated studies of personality change across the lifespan,
Mm.
it changes pretty dramatically. As people age, they tend to experience fewer negative emotions and more positive ones. They tend to be more conscientious, tend to put more emphasis on positive relationships. And so we know that personality changes naturally. And then in my research, which is like treatment research, mostly for people with anxiety and depression and borderline personality disorder, but really this is applicable to everybody, we know that we can speed up the process of personality change so that we can see 20 years worth of progress in like 20 weeks.
I never give up. I never give up. I never give up. Turn around.
Hi, folks. Welcome back to Neff Inspiration, my show on YouTube and as a podcast with me, your host, Stephan Neff. Once I've got you fresh, please press the like and the subscribe button down there so that you don't miss all the beautiful guests that I have the privilege and honor to bring onto my show. I constantly learn and constantly broaden my mind with their help, and I hope you can join me on that. So press the like and subscribe button. And today is no exception because I've got Shannon Sauer-Zavala with me. Shannon is a clinical psychologist from Kentucky, and she has got a specialty that is so important today. Whilst she, of course, looks at the issue of anxiety and depression, but more importantly, she actually looks at how small changes in our behavior, remember the 5-minute gardener that I always talk about and all the other little tricks, how little changes in behavior consistently applied will lead to dramatic changes in overall in your life. You become a better human, but you also change your personality. Now that's a cool one because many of us have got this perception and maybe, a wrong belief that personality is fixed and static and will never change. And that's actually not true. So I can't wait to learn more from Shannon. Welcome to my show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Wow. A personality. I mean, nowadays you can do all these kind of personality tests that are out there on the internet, often for free. And so many people are doing it, often youngsters, teenagers, etc., who are maybe a little bit lost in the world. You don't need to be a teenager to be nowadays lost in this world of 2024. It's a chaos left, right, and center. So I think a lot of people are searching for an identity, searching for a meaning in their life. Um, uh, is that not a good thing for people to do?
Yeah, I think that personality testing is really fun and can give you a lot of information or can summarize information about yourself in a really digestible way. And so I do think it gives people a sort of sense of control over an uncertain world or really understanding how they fit in the world.
Mm,
And it doesn't just extend to personality tests, right? Like we're seeing a huge upsurge in people, especially young people that are interested in like zodiac sign,
mm.
all of these different ways to try to understand yourself, some maybe more or less supported by science.
And that is already a bit of an understatement, isn't it? Well, are there personality tests that are scientifically based? I mean, you are a lecturer. You are there on the forefront of research. Are there good tests out there?
Yes. So there are really good evidence-based or scientifically backed personality tests.
Hmm?
The problem is that academic psychologists sort of need better PR because the personality tests that we study, that I use in my research and my clinical trials, are really different from most of the personality tests that you find online, right? And we're not just talking about like which Taylor Swift song perfectly matches your vibe. We're talking about Myers-Briggs, Enneagram. Those tests are, when they have been studied, which is not a lot, they do not predict future outcomes very well. In fact, they are not much better than knowing somebody's zodiac sign in terms of predicting relationship success, career success. And that's kind of crazy to me because, like, the Myers-Briggs in particular is a billion-dollar business used by HR departments, by schools to kind of funnel people into their ideal roles. And research suggests that it doesn't predict career outcomes.
Oops. It's interesting, though, that you're saying it's a multi-million or probably billion-dollar business, because every employer, understandably, wants to bring out the best out of their employees in order to make money. That's what their job is. So let's not be silly here. We are in a capital marketplace, and it's just capitalism is there. Okay. But having said that, is there not a pitfall that people take on a certain personality because they've done a test? Now, okay, I'm obviously more an whatever the label is you want to put on, whatever the drawer is you want to be put on, that they try to live up to that?
Yeah, so I think that that's kind of the problem with the ubiquity of these personality tests, because people don't necessarily know how to use the information gleaned from them. So you kind of mentioned this already, but when your employer is paying for you to take a personality test, they have their interest at heart, right? They're not trying to help you be your best self or self-actualize. They're trying to figure out what role to put you in to be most productive for them. And I think a lot of people, again, because we're trying to make sense of this uncertain world, it feels comfortable to be put into a box. But, when I hear people say, well, that wouldn't be a good fit for me because I'm an ENFJ, or, I'm a Libra, so I couldn't date a Taurus. Those are the things that really give me pause. And the big reason for that is when you look at scientifically validated studies of personality change across the lifespan, it changes pretty dramatically. As people age, they tend to experience fewer negative emotions and more positive ones. They tend to be more conscientious, tend to put more emphasis on positive relationships. And so we know that personality changes naturally. And then in my research, which is like treatment research, mostly for people with anxiety and depression and borderline personality disorder, but really this is applicable to everybody, we know that we can speed up the process of personality change so that we can see 20 years worth of progress in like 20 weeks. And so I hate the idea of a personality test telling you, you're this, stay in your lane.
Wow. And that is, of course, something very intriguing, because you have just mentioned personality disorders. You would think that once you have got such a situation being opened up to you, because you typically didn't know that you had this label, typically you would have thought that a personality disorder, that's it. This is genetically somehow predispositioned. You have it. That's your problem now for the rest of your life. If I hear you right, you can actually change things.
Yeah. And so most of my personality change clinical trial work is in the context of borderline personality disorder. And BPD is kind of a different personality disorder compared to some of the other diagnoses, because people with this condition tend to have a lot of distress, so they seek treatment. And I think that's a really important distinction, or a really important thing to consider when we talk about personality change. You have to have some stake. You have to want to be different in order to put yourself in situations that will help you grow. And so a lot of times people are perfectly fine or feel like they're perfectly fine the way that they are, and you don't necessarily see these changes. But I can say that in the context of BPD, we're seeing large changes in folks' personality across treatment.
Which is beautiful. And that fits also with many other sort of vignettes and clinical scenarios. I've had recently a guest on my show who had, out of the blue, a very nasty breakdown of her relationship. And she was really down and all. And she developed quite significant obsessive compulsive traits that came out, which were, beginning to really mess around with her. Now, she chose to deal with the trauma by actually going on a large journey and investigating a topic close to her heart. And amazingly, whilst she was on the road and interviewing people, there was no obsessive compulsive traits there. So instead of saying, hey, I'm obsessive compulsive, no, you have, for a time being, shown traits of obsessive compulsive disorder. So I think it's important that we actually distinguish of having traits and from now and then sort of letting them out compared with I am and being fixed, so to speak, to that diagnosis.
Yeah. And I think like even just defining at least how I think about personality sort of helps with that, right? Because personality, well, I'll start with what personality isn't. So it's not your likes and dislikes. It's not your tastes. It's not your sense of humor in my definition, right? So kind of the scientific definition of personality is your characteristic way of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And like you said at the beginning, we all think about personality as like fixed, right? That's my essence. That's me. But when you think of it as like your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors summarized, well, we change our perspective all the time with new information. We change how we feel about things and we change our habits. We develop new ones. That happens all the time. And if we maintain those changes to our thinking and feeling and behaving, then we're going to fill out those bubbles on the personality questionnaire differently, right? We, in essence, have changed our personality. And so I think when we try to move away from this idea of personality as our essence and more of like a useful label for what I'm thinking, feeling, and doing, generally speaking, right now, that frees up a lot of possibility to make changes.
Essentially, very similar to you choosing today to dress up maybe a little bit, put different clothes on and look really smart, whilst tomorrow you rather have your Jimmy Jams on the whole day, and that's just fine too. Now, is it really so easy? Or is it, I know already the answer there. It is certainly not as easy to just change some pair of clothes, but it is certainly possible because we all go through trauma. We all go through life challenges, some of us seemingly more than others, and sometimes they cluster. But inevitably, once you have gone through and once you have maybe made mistakes and learned from them, or maybe we're growing new sets of skills and employing them in a more continual way, you change inevitably. And that does mean also your personality changes, does it not?
Yeah. And that changes, I think that changes for most people, at least a little bit. There's a lot of variability, science tells us. So some people change a ton and some people hold steady. So there's a lot of variability across people. But naturally, most of us are changing at least a little bit. And again, like taking some intentional actions and paying attention to the consequences or the results can help speed up the process. So it's not easy per se. And I think you've got to have a reason to do it, right? There has to be a motivator. I think that's really important. So one thing that always comes up, or that I like to talk about when I'm talking about personality, is the kind of the introversion extroversion spectrum. And so a lot of people feel like the world was kind of built for extroverts. It's easier for extroverts out there. And sometimes introverts feel kind of unfairly maligned, I guess. And I'm here to say that if you're introverted and you get a ton of fulfillment out of spending some time alone, having fewer but close, meaningful relationships, and that's not bothering you, and that's not standing in the way of your goals or values, there's no reason to change your personality, right? So it's not like being extroverted is better than being introverted. It's just, is your personality as it currently is it working for you? is it getting in the way of living in accordance with your values? So if I'm introverted but I feel like I have this calling to start a company or a nonprofit or move into leadership in my corporation, I have to push myself a little bit. There's the motivator there to push myself out of my comfort zone a little bit. And if I maintain those changes over time, then I'm moving across that introverted spectrum, a little bit more extroverted, right? And like, maybe you're not aspiring to be a social butterfly, life of the party, but you're still sliding across that spectrum in line with your values.
But also, I guess, in line with the environment, because there are many versions of us. There is the true inner Stephan, who only probably 4 or 5 people in the world know, with all the secrets, warts and all. And then there is the sort of less hidden person that maybe a dozen people know. And then there's the person who I'm outwards. All of them are probably having different characteristics, and depending on my environment, I will display different traits and different things, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's perfectly natural, normal, and adaptive.
Well, exactly.
That's by design, right? I think that like the environment does play a really important role in the traits we display and any changes that we might experience, right? So when you look at genetic studies of personality, neuroticism, so the tendency to experience negative emotions, that's the one that has the highest kind of genetic loading, but it's still only something like 50%. So that means that like we can only sort of understand half of like how you experience negative emotions by knowing your genetics, right? And that means the other half is kind of totally determined by situations that you might be in, the environment, what has kind of been drawn from you over time. And I usually am encouraging when I'm working with someone with personality change, or really in therapy in general, I'm encouraging people to really pay attention to their environment, particularly any reinforcers. So when you change your behavior, if you step outside your comfort zone a little bit and people respond differently to you, you got to pay attention to that, right? If it works, then it's going to increase the likelihood that you're going to do it again. And that might change your view of yourself. But if you have a really like difficult or tough environment, right? Like, maybe you are working on being more assertive, but you live in a really punishing household. It's probably not going to be met. Your efforts to change is not going to be met externally with sort of like a reinforcing response. And that's going to make it harder to make those changes.
Very wise, very wise. Well, we know that there is a lot of generational trauma, and increasingly there's data coming out that certainly animal experiments that show that trauma from perceived in our previous generation is actually genetically handed down. Plus, if you then add in the adverse childhood experiences that causes core beliefs to be changed and warped, etc. How much do these influences come into play in your clinical work, and how much do we need to pay attention to those rather than in an isolated fashion look at you right now and look at you the way you're behaving and changes making to that behavior?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. So my sort of specialty is cognitive behavioral therapy, and that tends to be more present focused than past focused. But in my work, I spend a lot of time, especially if I'm working with people with BPD that, have a higher likelihood of having experienced adverse childhood experiences, have an increased likelihood of having experienced trauma. I want to make it really clear that even though their behaviors maybe aren't serving them, are taking them farther away from their values right now, that they make perfect sense, right? So when somebody, I don't know, engages in like what society would determine like bad relationship behaviors, maybe they're doing things like, oh, like I'm going to pick a fight so that we'll break up before you could leave me, or, I'm going to seek reassurance, or, I'm going to sabotage the relationship in other ways, right? Like we would define those as bad, not really healthy, probably not taking you closer to your value of like having an honest relationship. But if you've been hurt in the past, it makes perfect sense that you're engaging. So we really want, a lot of patients come in and have gotten this messaging, but like, man, you're crazy. Why are you doing that? That's nuts, and that's not something that we want to replicate in therapy. We want to really understand the function of the behavior. And we can do that like without having to spend a ton of time, really diving into the like ins and outs of everything that's happened to them. But we can still understand how the past influences the behavior that I'm engaging in now. And that fosters a discussion about whether or not those behaviors or those traits are outdated, right? So like I'm engaging in these protective behavior that served me where I grew up, but like as I'm trying to like learn that people can be trusted and I'm not being vulnerable at all, it's getting in the way. And so we have to revise.
Nice. And indeed, it is there are so many influences that are culminating into us being us right now. And if we wanted to implement change, it's sometimes difficult to know where to start. And I guess with every story, there is somewhere one key point that is right now of importance, and that's where therapy becomes individual and not something cookie cutter. Everyone gets the same approach. But if you sort of think of the majority of the people you meet in clinical practice, what are sort of the low-hanging fruits that are likely to help people realize and make progress in the challenges that they are facing?
Yeah. So I can talk about a couple of strategies that we use in therapy, particularly in this personality change space. So the first, and I kind of touched on this already, but the first and most important thing I think we do is help people identify their values. So we give people a list of like 11 different life domains, from family relationships, intimate partner relationships, parenting, friendships, career, personal growth, citizenship, spirituality, other ones.
Yeah.
But anyway, this whole list of life domains, and we give people a list of values words, right? Humility, honesty, accountability, trust, hundreds of words. And so we ask them to kind of identify for each one of these domains, what words or what values stand out to you? And then that's kind of the inspiration. And then they use those words to kind of come up with a sentence or like a core value. And the reason this is so important is because it gives us this yardstick against which to measure our behavior, right? Or our actions, our thoughts, right? Is what I'm doing right now, is how I'm responding in this situation, is it taking me closer to the person I want to be, farther away? And so it takes a lot as a therapist, like what I do and how I handle things has no or what I think someone should do has no bearing on what my clients do, right? Like if they're doing something and they feel like it's not taking them away from their values, who am I to judge, really? So they create kind of their own metric. And I think this is really powerful because as we move into the change skills, so like changing your thinking, changing your behavior, our clients really reference, well, it's not in line with my values, or, they're just bringing up the values. It seems like a really powerful piece, and goes back to that idea that like, we need a motivator. We need to have a reason to make these changes. Otherwise, why would we? They're hard.
So true. And often enough, these motivators come. And that's interesting. It's the same if we look at addiction, if we look at alcohol use disorder, because ultimately 95% of the people who really ought to think hard about their coping mechanisms of escaping their reality will be in complete denial. So you can offer them whatever possibility of treatment, whatever, they're in denial. They don't want to. I have no problem. So therefore, in that state, to make any lasting change is probably rather fraught with disaster, with failure. Whilst when finally the time is right and people have found themselves so far outside of their comfort zone that they absolutely need to listen and make change, then they're ready to. And that's the skin in the game that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I'm not here to tell a client, like, you need to drink less, even though I might think that for many of my clients, right? But what I will do is have them highlight their value for parenting. I want to be present. I want to be emotionally there. I want to be reading bedtime stories, and I can't if I'm passed out on the couch, right? And so I'm not going to be the one to suggest. We usually have this really awesome form. It's on my website for free if people want to download it. But basically, the columns are like, what was the situation? What did you think? What did you do? Did your behavior take you closer to your value or farther away? And I don't have to say anything, right? They're filling it out.
Nice. And I think that's really the most powerful way of working with it, because you're asking questions and the brain of your client, of your patient, is actually coming up with the solutions. And that's something that we need to recognize. Each and every one of us has got essentially all the answers in our head. The answers are just so deep down, and we often ask such stupid questions. Why me? Why me? Well, guess what? Your brain comes up with 20 reasons why you're a failure, why you are unlovable, why you are whatever you like to believe. The how and the who do I want to be when I grow up? Those kind of questions very few of us ask on a regular basis. We so often don't even know our moral compass. We often don't. We are so busy in our rat race, in our hamster wheel. Oh, goodness. Is that not something that is getting worse in the world? Is that not the reason that we see increasing desperation, increasing negative emotions in the world? Why do you think 2024 is showing so much chaos?
Yeah. I mean, from a mental health treatment provider perspective, it's really hard to tell, right? So on the one hand, I think, there's a lot of uncertainty in the world. There's a lot of, just like a lot of conflict over things that maybe shouldn't be political, right? Like just a lot of turmoil. And I think that can make people feel really unmoored. On the other hand, and this is kind of a positive thing, I think people are a lot more comfortable talking about their emotions. They're a lot more comfortable talking about mental illness. I mean, I think Gen Z is like kind of on point for, being willing to be like, yeah, I go to therapy. What of it? Like, it's like they all go to therapy. It's cool. And so we see a lot of people seeking treatment. The downside of that is there really aren't enough therapists in the world to meet the demand. But maybe it's a good thing that we're seeing people seeking treatment, not because rates of anxiety are actually on the rise, but more people are just more willing to seek treatment, more willing to talk about mental health.
Beautiful. And I think that is wonderful from a generation like mine, where basically you stuff your emotions down. A man doesn't cry, boys don't cry, all that shit.
Right.
Yeah, you're quite right. Having said that, whilst Gen Z might be an easier target as such, what do you do with baby boomers? How do we approach them? How do you approach my generation?
Yeah. So, I mean, really in the same way, right? And so, one of the really cool things about doing clinical trials is that you get people, I mean, you're giving away free treatment. So, you're getting people across the income
Mm.
spectrum, across the age spectrum.
Yeah.
And because you have enough people in, in these different kind of like groups or subgroups, you can actually analyze the data and see if there are any differences in outcomes as a function of like demographics.
Mm.
And we don't really see that in CBT. Like we don't really see that like older people are less likely to respond to treatment than younger people.
Mm.
And in fact, actually, like most of the personality change that we see occurs from like age 25 to 60. Like your
Mm.
personality changes more
Mm.
through there, and probably because you have more agency, right? Like your
Mm.
parents aren't controlling what you can do and where you can go.
Okay. Interesting. Very good point. And I love the freedom that you the seed that you plant in me, that the past truly doesn't equal the future, even when it comes to personality, when it comes to you growing. And I think that is a wonderful thing. We are not trained to a certain personality trait. We can work on that. We can unlock the chains and actually test other behaviors that, when repeated on a continual basis, change us into a new person, so to speak. And that is exciting. That is wonderful. My goodness.
Yeah. I mean, if I had taken a personality test when I was in high school, it probably would have told me to have a job with like no responsibility that people couldn't count on. And, if I had believed that, right? Like, I mean, I wouldn't be where I am now.
Oh,
And so
nice
I think
one.
that's really important.
Nice one. Nice one. And that's, of course, very hard because there are societies that very early on test, let's say, classically in Asian countries, Korea, etc. But there's huge pressure on young children um, to succeed and to be a certain kind of person. Inevitably, that leads to huge strife and to huge tears and sometimes suicide and pressures like that.
Yeah.
Um, do we see similar trends in other societies?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're describing a really clear sort of like cultural difference.
Mm.
But I think, parents always want the best for their kids.
Mm.
They just might not know what is best for their kids. And this is where I go, nobody like wakes up and is like, I'm going to
Yeah.
pressure my kid into a career in accounting that they hate.
Mm.
They're just thinking like, I just want my kid to have a stable job and a lot of money, and that's going to be good for them. And they
Mm.
shouldn't go to art school or whatever. But like, this is where I like to return to the values too, at the risk of sounding like a broken record. But, a lot of times when I work with people, you see this mismatch between like what is actually important to me and what I think should be important to me based on the messaging that I've gotten from my family. So, I think that like education and lifelong learning should be so important to me, or career. I need to be doing something that's very high status. And I'm killing myself to do that. And it's not really my value, right? When we see that mismatch, that's where we see a lot of like lack of fulfillment. We can see depression, we can see anxiety. It kind of comes
Mm.
out in those ways.
Mm. And it's so hard because society is changing and the way we live is changing so dramatically. So therefore, what maybe my parents, with all in their best intention, wanted me to do And what I took on as, that is no longer there. I mean, some jobs are disappearing, some careers are disappearing, and are now taken over by either automation or by AI nowadays. So there's constant change there. So we need to forgive our parents because they were, most of them were trying to do absolutely the best thing for us, but things are changing and we need to be aware of that fact. And we need to be able to pivot. And again, coming back to some of the personality traits that make that a little bit more difficult. So if we actually see a lot of anxiety there, then that anxiety might not be something negative. It might actually be a sign of your body and your mind recognizing, hang on, the values that previously were there and the life that was my life in the past is no longer there. There is no longer that job that gave me satisfaction, that gave me external validation, that gave me the pleasure there. So what do you do in such a case when suddenly the rug is pulled from underneath you because your job is gone? We saw a lot of that with COVID, when suddenly whole parts of the society who were into tourism, etc., lost their jobs. How do you deal with something like that?
Well, I think you made a really good point kind of at the beginning of this question, which is to say, like, maybe it's adaptive to be anxious in some situations. And like anxiety, it's an adaptive emotion. We all have it, right? Anxiety tells us, hey, this is high stakes, pay attention. And so a lot of times the anxiety itself isn't what causes the like mental health condition, like an anxiety disorder. It's how we cope with the anxiety. It's like, and basically the symptoms of an anxiety disorder are less about the anxiety and more about trying to avoid the anxiety in ways that get in the way of living your life. And so I think you're totally right. Like, sometimes people just experience things that are really shitty, and having a normal emotional response might be grief, right? Might be sadness. It's normal to feel sad. We talk about sadness after a loss, right? Like, you know, death in the family, breakup. Sometimes that loss can be, maybe I'm kind of losing some esteem because I'm not where I thought I would be in my life by now. And across all emotions, right? Like anger, right? When anger gets a bad rap because it gets associated with destructive behaviors, but like we'd be screwed if we didn't have anger. It lets us know that our boundaries have been crossed and tells us to protect ourselves. And so across all of these negative emotions, the whole purpose, we like have evolved to have these emotions, and the whole purpose is to communicate information about the environment to us and then to motivate us to take action. And so a lot of times the problem becomes that the action we try to take is more about stomping down those emotions than it is about doing the thing that the like anxiety is prompting us to do. I think like the best example I have for this is like procrastination. So you feel anxious because you have something coming up at work and you don't like that feeling, so you procrastinate, right? Makes you feel better right now, makes you feel way worse the night before, right? But the anxiety is there because it's being like, study. And if you study, the anxiety is going to come down more slowly because it's going to take you time to master the content. So all of that is to say, I think it's really normal after, after a job loss, right, to like experience anxiety, right? Because people are counting on you. You're counting on you. What are you going to do? And I think like this is another place where you can sort of reevaluate, how can I live in accordance with my values, even though this one specific way I was doing it before isn't an option for me anymore? Because value, like being dependable worker, being creative, right? Being a problem solver, like that doesn't mean you have to work at like X job. You can think about other ways that you can live in accordance with that value a little bit more flexibly.
Nice. And it's often those kind of traumas, those kind of new challenges that push you into a scenario where you are forced to reevaluate yourself. And certainly I'm so blessed with seeing all these beautiful guests on my show, virtually every single one of them has gone through a similar situation and has changed their trajectory massively. And now they are there and proving that ultimately it can be a huge blessing, that trauma will result in growth. And if you are taking the right steps, again, consistency, that you actually will see this growth towards a new version of yourself that often is better. And therefore, maybe a bit more serene because you're now living in accordance with your values. And therefore, it's virtually guaranteed that you change your personality with such a major impact. So I love that we can recognize that and actually also use the word personality now actually in the change. It is actually a beautiful freedom that you're installing with this show today. We have got so many chances to improve ourselves as humans. It's actually a wonderful, wonderful thing. Wow. If I put you as the president of the United States, and I give you all the power and a bit of money, few billions, what would you implement in the mental health sector in the United States?
I'm glad you. I was going to say, I'm so glad that you specified mental health.
Oh, there's so much.
I know. I was like, well, because my mind goes to mental health, but I'm like, there's probably some other things that you need to do.
Let's
I need
stick
to sign
with
some
mental
executive
health.
orders right now. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I think for me, a thing that I would change in the US is our willingness to fund preventive strategies, right? So one of the things, my kids go to public school and they go to, but it's small and it's lovely and it's a neighborhood school. They have what's called a Be Well room where they go and they learn mindfulness and they can learn like cognitive strategies and they learn how to cope with emotions.
Beautiful.
And they're getting that sort of emotional intelligence education. And I would love to see that implemented in a much more widespread way, because like I said, most of the time, like anxiety disorders develop because it's not because people are anxious. It's because people are using all of their energy to get rid of the anxiety in a way that doesn't work and makes things worse in the long term. And so teaching people it's cool to feel. It's okay. Not a big deal. Feelings are temporary. They come back down. They're telling you something. Don't push them away. Just really investing in sort of emotional education, I think could save a lot of money in the long run, right? A lot of lost productivity.
Absolutely.
We're talking like a politician. I think that would be really helpful.
I could not agree more. I always keep saying I would make it mandatory for every teenager to go 4 weeks into rehab. And being forced to live in this bubble of a good rehab, being exposed to your emotions, to your feelings, being exposed to coping mechanisms, meeting people who have made a lot of mistakes and who are now out there to show that there are different ways how to cope. All these beautiful things there as a mandatory experience, rather than people who maybe want to change, but then go onto TikTok or Instagram and try to have some education out there, thinking that some influencers, see, and because one celebrity spouts out something, you think, yeah, that's it, my new hero. And you think, oh, for fuck's sake.
That's why I'm on Instagram. I started my professional Instagram because I'm like, wait, like I'm an expert in this actually. People should follow me.
Exactly. And that is so beautiful. Well, you took the words out of my mouth, woman. Shannon, where can people find you? Where can we hear more about Shannon?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am on Instagram, like I said, at self.made.personality. I'm on Twitter. That's where I post like my research findings. So if you're more interested in kind of the scientific aspects, that's at Sauer-Zavala. It's just my last name, no hyphen. And my website is www.personality-compass.com. And that's a great place to take a free science-based personality questionnaire that we consider a starting point, not a box, and access to a lot of free worksheets that we use in our clinical trials to get started with this nudging personality idea.
Beautiful. Guys, look down there into the description of the YouTube video and of the podcast because Shannon's details are down there. Whilst you're down there, press the like, the subscribe button. And if you got something really cool out there out of the interview, an aha moment, so to speak, why don't you put it down there into the comments? And well, we'll see what is coming out. Let's share our insights and let's share our passion to make this world a better place. And Shannon, I'm very, very grateful that you came today to be a guest on my show. I certainly learned a lot.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much for having me.
No trouble at all. And you guys out there, look after yourself and live with intention. Bye.
I never give up. I never give up. I never give up. Turn around.